Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. Day 4. The first sighting. The hours blurred together, each passing minute seeming to stretch into an eternity as the survivors moved deeper into Blackwood Facility. The low hum of the generator was the only sound that seemed to accompany them, its stuttering rhythm echoing through the endless corridors like a heartbeat. The air was dense, heavy with decay, and every breath felt like it took more effort than it should have. The unsettling silence in the hallways was broken only by the occasional scrape of their boots against the grimy concrete floor. Neil found himself unable to stop looking over his shoulder, half expecting something, or someone, to be lurking just out of sight. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. It gnawed at the back of his mind, an ever-present reminder that something wasn't right here. But what exactly that something was, he couldn't yet grasp. "I can't stand this silence," Evelyn muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted nervously around the space, glancing at the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. "There's no way this place is truly abandoned. It's like something's still here." Her words struck a chord with Neil. She was right. The facility had been left to rot for years, yet it still felt like it was alive. There were signs of something moving through the place. Signs of something that shouldn't have been moving. Lucas had been quiet for some time, his eyes glued to his camera as he documented their every step. His obsession with uncovering the truth, no matter the cost, had pushed him into this madness. But even now, with the camera in hand, there was something different about his expression, something that bordered on fear. He had seen government conspiracies, classified cover-ups, and shady experiments. But the magnitude of what they were walking into was beginning to unravel his usual bravado. "Do you guys hear that?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice tense. He lowered his camera, a look of confusion crossing his face. Neil paused, holding up his hand. Was that a whisper? At first, there was nothing. Just the silence, the oppressive, thick silence that hung in the air like a cloud, pressing against their ears. Then it came again, faint but distinct, a whisper. A voice. "Help!" It was barely audible, like the sound of a breeze barely rustling the leaves. But there was something unsettling about it, something wrong in its tone. It wasn't a voice asking for help in desperation. It was a voice that was too calm, too knowing, as if it had been waiting for them. "Did you hear that?" Neil asked, his voice strained. Evelyn and Lucas nodded slowly, their faces pale. Even Marcus, who had been the calmest of them all, looked around warily, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol holstered at his side. They weren't alone, and whatever was in here with them was watching. They moved cautiously forward, following the flickering emergency lights down a narrow hallway lined with decaying office doors. The whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder and more frequent as they moved deeper into the facility. "Do you think they were the last people to work here?" Evelyn asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. She glanced at the worn-out files scattered along the floor, old research notes and protocols half hidden beneath the thick layer of dust. "Do you think they were the ones who, whatever happened here?" Lucas didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something ahead, something at the end of the corridor, where a faint light flickered. It was a room, a large, abandoned lab filled with long-forgotten equipment. A series of glass tanks lined the walls, some cracked, others shattered, still holding the remnants of what had once been something alive. The smell in here was the worst yet, rotting flesh mixed with the sour stench of chemicals long past their expiration date. But it wasn't the smell that made Neil's stomach turn. It was the sight of what remained in the tanks, the bodies. They had been human once, most of them anyway. Their bodies were now twisted, their forms warped in ways that defied nature. There was no other word for them but monstrous. Some had multiple limbs, others had elongated spines, their faces stretched out of shape with grotesque, jagged features. Their skin was unnaturally smooth, almost glossy, and they had been preserved in some horrific stasis. As they stared into the tanks, Neil's mind raced. Was this what they had been studying? What had they been trying to create? The walls were littered with incomplete research notes, half-burned files with frenzied scribbles scrawled across them. Neil picked up one of the surviving documents. It was dated October 3, 1989, and the title was simple yet chilling. Subject 37, Final Mutation Results. The note read, Subject 37 has surpassed all expectations. Genetic material has evolved at an accelerated rate. However, Subject 37 is beginning to exhibit signs of intelligent behavior. Efforts to isolate and contain have been unsuccessful. Subject is now demonstrating social cooperation with other subjects. Neil's hands trembled as he set the paper down. He couldn't finish reading it. He knew what it meant. The creatures weren't just experiments anymore. They had learned how to communicate. They were evolving. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the lab. The entire group froze. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, almost too deep to be human. It echoed down the hall, vibrating in their chest like the sound of an earthquake. Then, from the shadows of the far corner, something moved. It wasn't the slow, deliberate movement of the creatures they had encountered before. It was fast, too quiet. For a moment there was nothing. Then it appeared. A figure, human but not human, emerged from the darkness. Its body was long and spindly, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes wide and glassy, too large for its skull. It looked like a person that had been bent, twisted, and stretched out of shape. Its jaw unhinged with a sickening crack, revealing rows of jagged, mismatched teeth, yellow and cracked. And in that moment, Neil knew. This was not something they had created by accident. It had been created with purpose. The creature stepped closer, its movements smooth and calculated. It stopped just out of reach, its mouth snapping open as it let out a breathy, rattling sound, a grotesque mockery of speech. "Welcome." The voice was thin, too high-pitched, like the sound of a child speaking from the dark. But the words were clear, and they struck Neil's heart like an icy dagger. "We've been waiting for you." Day 5. The hunt, the darkness seemed to close in on them as they huddled in the cramped security room. The facility's power had been cut, leaving them in a state of half-light, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls as their flashlights flickered sporadically. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the echo of their own breathing. Neil stared at the faded blueprints of Blackwood Facility spread out across the table. His finger traced the map's outlines, searching for any possible exit. But the more he examined it, the more he realized that they were trapped. The entrances had all been sealed off, and there was no direct way to reach the surface. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside. They had heard that sound before, the heavy, wet steps of something enormous stalking them. It wasn't just one creature. There were more. "Get back," Marcus hissed, pulling Evelyn behind him and pressing a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. They could hear the creature's low, guttural growls echoing in the dark. They were close now, their footsteps sharp and measured as they approached, surrounding them. "They're waiting for us," Neil murmured under his breath. "They know we're here." Evelyn shook her head, fear creeping into her voice. "This is something different. They're not just hunting, they're communicating, coordinating. It's like they've learned how to." Her sentence was cut off as a loud bang echoed through the room. One of the reinforced steel doors in the hallway slammed open with terrifying force, its hinges shrieking as if the creature on the other side was trying to tear it from its frame. They didn't have time to react. A shape rushed at them, fast, impossibly fast, barely visible in the dark. Then it was in the room, a blur of muscle and bone, a twisted, grotesque parody of humanity. Its body was too large, limbs too long, skin stretched taut over swollen muscles. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human's, its mouth split wide in an unnatural grin, jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. Marcus barely had time to react. He fired. The gunshot rang out in the confined space, the noise deafening in the silence of the room. The bullet slammed into the creature's chest, but it didn't fall. It barely flinched. The thing lunged. Marcus ducked, rolling across the floor just as the creature's massive hand reached for him. The air was thick with the stench of decay as the creature's long, twisted fingers scraped against the concrete floor, leaving bloody gouges in the stone. It was on him in an instant, its claws sinking into his shoulder with bone-crushing force. Evelyn screamed, but it was too late. The creature dragged Marcus across the floor, slamming his body against the walls with sickening thuds. His voice was lost in a strangled cry as his body twisted unnaturally. "Marcus!" Neil shouted, rushing forward, but Evelyn grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait, it's trying to lure us out," she gasped, her face pale with terror. But it was already too late. The creatures, had begun their hunt. Maury shapes emerged from the shadows, humanoid but grotesque, moving with a disjointed fluidity that only amplified their unnaturalness. There were no more attempts to hide. They were toying with them, enjoying the terror. They surrounded the room like a pack of predators circling their prey, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent intelligence. The walls closed in as the creatures closed the distance, their growls vibrating the very air. The one that had been closest to Marcus, the one he'd shot, stepped back, allowing its comrades to step forward. There were too many to count, their bodies constantly shifting in the darkness. They were like shadows made flesh, their long limbs scraping against the walls as they stalked the survivors. Neil's pulse was a hammering rhythm in his ears. He had to act. He glanced toward the security door, the last line of defense. If they could reach it, if they could get the power back on. The lights flickered on for a moment, casting harsh, blinding light across the room. In that instant, Neil saw them. A dozen of them. And then in the background, he saw Marcus, or what was left of him. The man's body was twisted unnaturally, his joints snapped the wrong way, his back arched painfully. His fingers were bent in grotesque angles, his eyes glazed over as he turned toward them, a low, growling noise escaping from his throat. He was no longer the man they knew. He had become one of them. It wasn't just a mutation. It was something deeper, something smarter. They were adapting, learning, evolving beyond what Blackwood's researchers had ever intended. The line between the creatures and the humans they had once been was beginning to blur. Evelyn was the first to act. Her mind was racing, calculating. She had to get them out of here. Without warning, she bolted toward the far end of the room, grabbing the emergency medical kit off the table and tossing it toward Neil. "Go for the vents," she said, voice tight with panic. "We'll have a better chance of getting through the maintenance tunnels. It's our only shot." Marcus, no, the thing that had once been Marcus, turned its head toward her, a sickeningly slow, deliberate movement. Its mouth opened wider, stretching far too wide, revealing rows of teeth that weren't human. And then it smiled. It was a grotesque, mocking gesture, as if it knew something they didn't. Neil and Evelyn bolted toward the maintenance corridor, the flashlight beam illuminating the narrow passageway as they scrambled. Behind them, they could hear the sound of claws scraping against metal as the creatures followed them, undeterred, faster than any human could run. The moment they reached the air vent, they squeezed through the narrow opening, the steel grating biting into their skin. They weren't safe, not yet, but they had bought themselves time. For now, they were alive. They kept moving, but the creatures were patient. They always were. Day 6, the final revelation, the security measures had sealed them inside. The creatures weren't hunting them, they were herding them. Neil's mind raced through every piece of evidence they had uncovered. The Blackwood experiments had never been about medicine nor disease prevention. They were something far more insidious, a forced evolution, an attempt to sculpt a new apex predator. But the researchers had made one fatal miscalculation. They hadn't created monsters. They had created something smarter. The facility wasn't abandoned. It was a feeding ground. A shadow shifted in the corridor ahead, followed by the telltale sound of wet, labored breathing. Lucas barely had time to react before a long, sinewy arm shot out from the darkness, pulling him violently into the black. He didn't scream. He couldn't. His body twitched violently, an unnatural, convulsing transformation beginning before their very eyes. His spine elongated, skin bubbling as his skull cracked and reshaped. The thing that had been Lucas turned toward them, its mouth splitting open in a silent grin. It had learned something new, how to mimic, and how to blend in. A new horror gripped the survivors. There was no way to know if they were still themselves, and the creatures were waiting for them to figure it out. Day 7. The inescapable, the clock in the corner of the control room had stopped ticking. It had been hours, maybe more. Time had lost all meaning here. The air was thick with the damp smell of mildew and decay, yet there was something more acrid beneath it, a faint metallic scent that lingered in the corners of the room, seeping into their skin, their lungs. Neil's eyes kept flicking to the door, to the windows beyond the shattered glass. The monsters, things, they were still out there, still watching. He could feel them. It wasn't just in the air, it wasn't just the way the lights flickered. It was an almost tangible presence, something pressing against him, against all of them. They had barricaded themselves inside the control room, but the security door had already been compromised. The creatures didn't need keys or codes to get in. They only needed patience. And Neil knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this wouldn't last long. Every second was a countdown. Marcus was pacing, his eyes darting to the door, then to the flickering monitors on the desk. "The comms are down," he muttered, frustration bleeding into his voice. "We can't even contact anyone outside. This was their plan all along, wasn't it? Trap us here, trap everyone who ever came near this place." Evelyn was silent. She stood by the desk, her eyes glued to the screen. It wasn't a map or a set of coordinates she was looking at. It was a diagram, one of the many they had uncovered in the labyrinth of files. One detailing the genetic modification procedures that had been carried out on the human subjects. It wasn't just mutation, it was evolutionary hijacking. And the creatures, they were the proof. Evelyn swallowed, her voice thin, shaking. They weren't just changing their DNA, they were changing the entire concept of humanity. They were forcing evolution to happen in a matter of days, weeks at best. But she trailed off, her hand shaking as she scrolled through the text. "There's something here, something we didn't see before." Neil approached her, his heart beating faster. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he read over her shoulder. It was a passage, an afterthought in the research notes that had never been fully explored. The final stage of the experiment, symbiosis, symbiosis. The word echoed in his mind. "What does that mean?" Neil asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Evelyn's lips parted, her gaze lost in the cold, sterile words on the screen. It means they weren't just trying to make something stronger, they were trying to merge. To create a new form of life, a perfect hybrid. Something that was neither human nor beast, but both. A new species, one that could evolve at an accelerated rate, adapt to any environment. And now, her voice cracked. And now, it's more than just an experiment. The realization hit them like a punch to the stomach. The creatures were evolving faster than they could understand, faster than they could comprehend. And they weren't hunting just for survival, they were hunting for dominance. They weren't predators, they were competitors. They were trying to reclaim the Earth, to make it their own. The lights flickered again, and the entire facility seemed to groan in response. A low rumble echoed through the walls, vibrating the floor beneath their feet. Neil's eyes widened in horror. It wasn't just the creatures. The facility itself was moving. The walls were shifting. The corridors were changing. He had read enough to know that the facility had been designed to adapt, to withstand external threats. But it had never been intended for the kind of change they were seeing. The walls weren't just crumbling, they were adapting with the creatures. The control systems were failing, yes, but something else was happening. The genetic modifications had begun to permeate the facility itself. The walls pulsed with a strange, organic rhythm, like a heartbeat. The air grew thicker. The lights dimmed and flashed erratically as the entire complex seemed to respond to the creatures. Neil felt it in his bones. The place was alive now, and it had been awakened. "Get to the surface," Marcus hissed. "We need to find a way out. We have no choice now." He moved quickly toward the door, only to freeze as something stopped him in his tracks. The scratching, the wet, labored breathing, they were back. And this time they were not alone. Neil's heart raced as he turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Shadows moved, flickered, and bent in unnatural ways. There was no longer a sense of time here, no longer any safety to cling to. The walls were closing in, the air suffocating. The creatures, the ones that had once been human, were everywhere. And at that moment, the reality of it all hit him. They weren't in control anymore. The facility was alive, its walls breeding the things that had once been kept inside. The monsters weren't just escaping, they were merging with the space itself. The more they ran, the more the walls adapted to trap them. The passageways that had once been their means of escape had transformed into deadly mazes. The creatures were everywhere, their inhuman forms shifting in and out of shadows, waiting. Neil's mind reeled with a sudden, desperate thought. What if we're not meant to survive? His voice was barely audible, his throat tight. Evelyn turned, her face pale, but her eyes full of understanding. We're not. None of us are. The weight of the truth crushed down on him. This was the endgame. Blackwood Facility had never been about containment. It had been about creation. It had always been meant to fail, to evolve into something more. And they were a part of it now, a part of the experiment, not just subjects, but fuel for something far more terrifying. The creatures weren't just changing the humans, they were changing the world around them. And now they were going to change them. Day 8. The hollowing, the air inside Blackwood was no longer air. It clung to their lungs, thick and damp, coating their throats with something wrong, a texture, a taste, something they couldn't name but felt in every breath. The facility groaned, shuddered, expanded. Walls that had once been steel and concrete now pulsed like muscle, like tendons. The floors beneath their feet creaked, not like old tile but like bone. Neil ran. They all did. Marcus was in front, weapon gripped tight, leading them through the shifting corridors. Evelyn followed, her fingers clenched around the research notes she had stuffed into her jacket. The pages crinkled with every step. Neil brought up the rear, his mind a hurricane of thoughts, but none more terrifying than the truth now sinking in. There was no more Blackwood Facility. The place they had entered days ago had ceased to exist. In its place stood something else entirely, something new, something that had never belonged to this world. It had been rebuilt from the inside, like a cocoon splitting open, shedding its skin. The creatures weren't just evolving anymore. They were consuming, rebuilding this place in their own image. Neil had spent his life studying evolution, but this wasn't adaptation. It was something else, something far worse. Evolution was a process, a slow, meticulous unfolding of biology over millennia. This was a rewrite. And then he heard it, footsteps, not theirs. Something else was running with them, behind them, beside them. Shadows flickered at the edges of the hallway. The overhead lights pulsed like a dying heartbeat, revealing flashes of wrongness, elongated limbs that moved too fast, heads twisting at unnatural angles. Neil caught a glimpse of one shape that looked almost familiar. Lucas, or what was left of him. His body had become something grotesque, his torso lengthened, his arms stretching like sinew-bound cables. His face, God, his face, was still forming, still shifting, as if the remnants of humanity inside him hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. And worst of all, he was smiling, mimicking, pretending. It knew them. It knew how to act human. Marcus raised his rifle. Too late. The creature lunged. The breaking point, the impact sent them all sprawling. Neil hit the floor hard, skidding against the damp, fleshy tile. Evelyn screamed, scrambling backward as the thing that had been Lucas bore down on them, its limbs jerking with unnatural grace. Marcus fired, the muzzle flash carving deep shadows into the walls, but the bullets barely slowed it down. Lucas, no, the thing that wore his skin, cocked its head. It moved its jaw, testing the muscles, stretching its lips into something close to speech. "Help me." It was his voice, but wrong, warped, strained, a mockery of the man he had once been. Marcus hesitated just for a second, and in that second the creature moved. It was faster than anything human. Its elongated fingers lashed out, sinking deep into Marcus's shoulder, twisting against bone. A wet crack, a muffled grunt of pain. Marcus staggered, but his knife was already in his hand. He didn't think, he just stabbed. Once, twice, a third time. The blade sank into the thing's neck, but it barely reacted. Its body convulsed, flesh rippling as it absorbed the damage, adapting to the wound. Marcus roared in frustration, driving the knife deeper until the creature mimicked him. It reached up, grabbed his hand, and forced the blade into his own throat. Neil and Evelyn barely had time to react before Marcus dropped. Not dead, not yet, but the creature had learned something new: how to kill without killing, how to leave its victims alive enough to change. Marcus twitched on the ground, his breath ragged, his veins darkening with something spreading, moving, rewriting him from the inside out. Evelyn grabbed Neil's arm. "We can't save him," she whispered, "but we can still save ourselves." She turned, ran, and heart-pounding, Neil followed. The revelation: they didn't stop until they reached the stairwell. It was the only place left that still felt real. The last remnants of the original structure remained here: the cold steel railings, the concrete steps, the faded emergency exit signs flickering in dim light. Evelyn was gasping for breath, her hands shaking. "They weren't just mutating them," she said. "They were learning. The creatures, they're perfecting themselves." Neil pressed a hand to his forehead, sweat slick on his skin. "Perfecting for what?" Evelyn looked at him, her eyes hollow. "To leave." The weight of the words crushed him. He had been so focused on the facility, on escaping, on understanding the creatures. But he hadn't considered the worst possibility. This place was never meant to contain them. It was just a womb. And now the things inside were ready to be born. A sound rose from below them, a deep, guttural hum that vibrated through the stairwell. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't human. It was something waking up. The creatures weren't hunting anymore. They were ascending, going to the surface, going out. Neil's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Evelyn, desperation in his voice. "We have to stop them." Her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. She nodded, because she knew if these things reached the outside world, it was over, for everyone, for everything, for humanity itself. Day 9. The last stand. There was no time left. Neil and Evelyn sprinted up the stairwell, their ragged breaths swallowed by the deep, pulsing hum rising from below. The creatures weren't chasing them anymore. They didn't need to. They had already won. At the top of the stairs, they found it. The control room, buried under layers of dust and disuse. The monitors flickered weakly, half-broken, static-riddled. But the main power override was still intact. Evelyn's hands flew across the controls. Emergency lockdown. Full facility purge. The only failsafe left in a place built to contain something never meant to exist. "It'll destroy everything," she said, voice shaking. "Us included." Neil hesitated, but only for a second. He nodded. Evelyn slammed her palm against the final command. "Purge initiated." The facility screamed. From deep below, a monstrous, collective shriek rippled through the walls. They knew they weren't ready to leave yet. They weren't done evolving. The walls shook. Flesh and steel trembled. A surge of heat roared up through the stairwell as Blackwood began to die. Neil and Evelyn didn't wait to see what came next. They ran. The upper floors were already collapsing as the lockdown triggered a chain reaction of destruction. Floods of fire burst from ruptured vents. Glass imploded. The entire building was consuming itself, swallowing everything inside. The exit was just ahead. The last security door loomed before them, jammed slightly open. An escape. Evelyn reached it first. She turned back to Neil and stopped. Her eyes widened. Neil froze. Something was wrong. Evelyn's expression twisted in horror, her voice barely a whisper. "Neil, your arm." He looked down, his veins dark, spreading. He hadn't escaped it, not completely. The realization hit like a gunshot. He was changing. And if he left, Evelyn's eyes filled with something unreadable, a mixture of sorrow, understanding, and resolve. She stepped back. The door started closing. "Evelyn, no." Neil lunged forward, but she was already slamming the release. The lock engaged. The mechanism hissed. Her voice broke as she whispered, "You can't leave." Neil pounded on the glass. "Evelyn, please." But she was already gone. Through the glass, Neil saw her sprint into the darkness, disappearing into the burning remains of Blackwood. And then the explosion. A shockwave tore through the ground. The world erupted in a blinding flash of heat and light, swallowing Blackwood whole. And Neil Carter burned with it. Aftermath. Days later, authorities discovered the smoking crater where Blackwood Facility had once stood. Nothing remained. No survivors. No explanations, just ashes. The official reports called it an underground gas explosion, a tragic accident, another classified location erased from history. But in the quiet corners of government offices, some people knew better. Some people had seen things like this before, and some people were still watching. Because the truth was simple. Blackwood was gone, but evolution never stops. And somewhere, out in the world, something had survived. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.